Waverly Marin turned 18 on a Tuesday in February, and the world did not pause to acknowledge it. There was no singing in the kitchen, no candles pushed into grocery store frosting. No one had written her name on anything, not a card, not a napkin, not even the back of a receipt. The house smelled the way it always did in winter. Coffee that had been sitting too long, damp coats drying on the radiator, the faint chemical trace of medication that never quite left the hallway. She stood in the doorway of her small room, the one at the end of the hall that used to be a storage closet before they put a mattress in it, and she looked at the duffel bag sitting on the floor by the front door. It wasn't hers. She didn't own a duffel bag, but someone had packed it for her. Diane Felton stood by the kitchen sink with her arms folded across her chest. She was a tall woman, narrow through the shoulders, with a jaw that always seemed clenched, even when she wasn't angry. Her hair was pulled back tight. Her eyes moved to Waverly, and then away again, like looking too long would cost her something she couldn't afford. The coffee maker gurgled behind her, filling the silence that neither of them seemed willing to break. "The check stopped," Diane said. She didn't explain what that meant. She didn't have to. Waverly had understood the economics of her own existence since she was 12 years old. The state sent money, the Feltons kept her. That was the arrangement. Not love, not duty, arithmetic. "We talked about this." Diane continued, her voice flat and practiced, like she had rehearsed the words in front of the bathroom mirror that morning. "You're 18 now. Legally, we're not responsible anymore." Waverly nodded slowly. The motion felt mechanical, like her body was running a script her mind hadn't approved. Across the room, Gordon Felton leaned against the doorframe that separated the kitchen from the living room. He was softer than his wife, rounder in the face, slower in his movements, the kind of man who always looked like he had just woken up from a nap he didn't mean to take. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his corduroy pants, and he stared at the floor like it owed him an explanation. He opened his mouth, then closed it. On the kitchen table, arranged in a neat and deliberate row, sat a stack of envelopes. Medical bills. Waverly didn't need to read the numbers. She had seen them before in different amounts from different hospitals, all addressed to the same household, all stamped in red. From down the hall came the sound she had grown so used to that she almost didn't hear it anymore. A thin, uneven cough. Then silence. Then another cough wetter, this time followed by the creak of a bed frame. Brendan. Brendan Felton was 16 years old and had been sick for as long as Waverly could remember. Not the kind of sick that gets better with rest and orange juice. The kind that requires specialists and overnight stays and machines that hum in the dark. The kind that turns parents into accountants, counting every dollar twice, measuring love in copays and deductibles. Waverly noticed all of it. The envelopes, the cough, the way Gordon's shoulders curved inward like he was trying to make himself smaller, the way Diane's knuckles whitened around her own forearms. She always noticed. That was the curse of being someone who paid attention in a house that preferred silence. And because she noticed, she understood. She understood that the Feltons were not villains. They were people standing at the edge of something they couldn't survive, and she was the weight they had decided to drop first. Not because she was hated, because she was the one who could be let go. Understanding didn't make it hurt less. If anything, it made it worse. Because there was no one to be angry at. No door to slam, no argument to win. Just a quiet Tuesday morning and a duffel bag that someone else had packed. "I could stay a couple more days," Gordon muttered. He said it almost to himself, like a thought that had wandered out of his mouth by accident. "No," Diane's voice cut clean. "We talked about this, Gordon. That was it. The decision had already been made, probably days ago, maybe weeks. This morning was just the formality, the goodbye without the word goodbye." Waverly walked to the duffel bag and picked it up. It was lighter than she expected. Lighter than it should have been for a life packed into canvas and nylon. She thought about that weight for a moment. 18 years. That was how long she had been alive. And everything she owned, everything that was hers, and not borrowed or temporary or assigned by a system that processed children like paperwork, fit inside a bag she could carry with one hand. She unzipped it just enough to check. A few shirts, a pair of jeans, socks that didn't match. A toothbrush still in its plastic wrapper. No photographs, no keepsakes, nothing that said someone had thought about what she might want to carry. In the front pocket, she found a small envelope with cash inside. She counted it without removing the bills. $121. Enough to buy a bus ticket to somewhere, not enough to arrive. Her fingers slipped into her jacket pocket, the one on the left side, the one with the small hole in the lining that she had never bothered to fix. And there it was, the coin, small, silver, worn smooth along the edges from years of being held by hands that were no longer alive. It had no particular shine, no obvious value. If you found it on the street, you might not even pick it up. Scrap metal, Diane had called it once 2 years ago when she found it on Waverly's nightstand and asked what it was. She hadn't meant it cruelly, she just didn't know. Most people wouldn't. Waverly closed her hand around it and felt the cold weight settle against her palm. It was the only thing in the world that had been given to her on purpose. The only object that came with a voice attached. Her grandfather's voice. Silas Marin had been a quiet man. Not shy, not withdrawn, just quiet in the way that certain old trees are quiet. Present, rooted, unbothered by the noise around them. He had thick hands and deep-set eyes, and a way of looking at you that made you feel like he was reading a page in a book only he could see. He had worked on trains his whole life, not driving them, fixing them. He had been a railroad mechanic on a freight line that ran through the northern forests, the kind of line that carried timber and coal and things people needed but never thought about. He knew every bolt, every hinge, every rusted seam on those cars. He could tell you which ones had been built in the 40s and which ones had been retrofitted in the 70s just by the sound they made when the wind hit them right. Waverly had lived with him until she was 9. Those years were the only ones she thought of when someone asked about her childhood. Not the years before which she couldn't remember. Not the years after which she preferred to forget. Just those years. The small house near the tracks. The smell of oil and pine. The way Silas would sit on the porch in the evening and not say anything for hours, and somehow that silence felt more like company than any conversation she had had since. He had never explained why he couldn't keep her. Not directly, but she remembered the day he told her she was going somewhere else. He had been sitting in his recliner, the one that creaked every time he shifted his weight. He looked smaller than usual that day. Fragile, like time had reached in and taken something structural out of him. "I can't raise you the way you deserve," he had said. His voice was calm but heavy like a stone dropped into still water. "But I can make sure you end up somewhere stable." Stable. That was the word he had used. Not happy, not good. Stable. Like he knew the difference and had made his peace with settling for less. The Felton household had been stable back then. They had a steady income, a quiet neighborhood, a house with a yard and a mailbox, and all the things that looked right from the outside. Silas had done his research. He had talked to the social worker. He had visited twice before signing the papers. And maybe in the beginning the Feltons had meant well. Maybe they looked at that 9-year-old girl and felt something close to warmth. But warmth is expensive to maintain when everything else is falling apart. And over the years, the warmth thinned out, replaced by obligation, then tolerance, then the kind of silence that lives in houses where no one says what they actually mean. Waverly knew all of this. She had assembled the story piece by piece over the years, the way you might reconstruct a broken plate, not because you want to use it again, but because you need to see the shape of what it was. The last time she saw Silas was the day she left his house. He had walked her to the car, carrying her small suitcase in one hand. His other hand rested on her shoulder, and she remembered thinking how warm it was despite the cold air. Before she got in, he crouched down so they were eye to eye. His knees cracked. His breath came out in a thin white cloud, and he pressed the silver coin into her palm. His fingers closed around hers for a moment, holding them there, and she felt the roughness of his skin and the steadiness of his grip and something else she wouldn't have a name for until years later. Intention. He was giving her something on purpose, not out of obligation or guilt, or the hurried generosity of someone trying to feel better about a decision already made. He was giving her something he had chosen. "Some things don't look like much," he said, holding her gaze, "but they're the only things that stay real." Then he stood up, and she got in the car, and the door closed, and the distance between them grew wider with every mile until it became permanent. Silas passed away 3 years later. A heart attack in the middle of the night. No warning, no last words. Just there one day and gone the next, the way freight trains pass through towns that don't have stations. Waverly found out 2 days after it happened. Diane mentioned it at dinner the way someone might mention a change in the weather. "Your grandfather died," she said. They already handled the funeral. Waverly had gone to her room that night and held the coin so tightly it left a circle pressed into her skin. She didn't cry, not because she didn't want to, because the tears felt too small for what she had lost. Now standing in the Feltons' kitchen on her 18th birthday, she held the coin again. And she thought of something Silas had told her once years ago on one of those porch evenings when the sky turned purple and the trains rattled past in the distance. If you ever run out of places to go, he had said, his voice steady but far away, like he was talking to someone who wasn't there yet. Go there. It won't lie to you. She had asked him where he meant. He just shook his head and said she would know when the time came. She hadn't understood it then. She understood it now. Waverly zipped the duffel bag shut, lifted it onto her shoulder, and walked to the front door. She didn't look back at Diane. She didn't wait for Gordon to find the words he had been searching for all morning. She didn't glance down the hall toward Brendan's room, even though part of her wanted to. She opened the door. The cold hit her like a wall. February air, sharp and absolute, the kind that doesn't negotiate. Snow had fallen overnight and the sidewalk was buried under a thin, even layer of white that no one had bothered to clear. She stepped outside. Behind her, the door shut with a quiet final click. No one called her name. And for the first time in her life, Waverly realized something with complete and unshakable clarity. She wasn't leaving home. She just didn't have one anymore. The walk north took longer than she expected. Not because the distance was far, although it was, but because the cold slowed everything down. It got into her joints, her fingers, the muscles along her jaw. Her sneakers, thin, canvas things that had already been worn through at the heel, soaked through with it in the first 10 minutes. After 20, she couldn't feel her toes. After 40, she stopped trying. She passed the gas station at the edge of town, the one with the crooked sign and the single working pump that always smelled like kerosene. A man inside was reading a newspaper behind the counter. He didn't look up. She thought about going in, buying something warm, coffee maybe, or one of those shrink-wrapped sandwiches that sit under heat lamps until the bread turns translucent. She had money. $121 could buy a lot of gas station coffee. But she kept walking. Because once you stop, you start thinking, and once you start thinking, you start negotiating with yourself. And Waverly knew from experience that negotiations with yourself always end in surrender. She passed the last row of houses, the ones with aluminum siding and chain-link fences and plastic chairs stacked on porches like promises someone forgot to keep. A dog barked from behind a window. A curtain moved and fell still. She saw a woman come out of one of the houses to check her mailbox, wearing a bathrobe and slippers. And for a brief, strange moment, Waverly envied her so intensely it felt like a physical pain. Not the house, not the mailbox, the bathrobe. The casual, unconscious certainty that you could walk outside in a bathrobe because you had a door to walk back through. Waverly didn't have a door anymore. She had a direction. After that, there was nothing. No houses, no signs, no streetlights, just the road narrowing into a two-lane stretch that the county only plowed when someone complained, and the trees closing in from both sides like they had been waiting for the town to end so they could take back what was theirs. The sky was a flat, heavy gray. The kind of gray that didn't suggest a storm so much as a long, slow pressure, like the sky itself was tired and leaning down. Waverly walked with her head lowered, her shoulders drawn and the duffel bag bumping against her hip with every step. She counted her footsteps for a while, then stopped when the numbers got too high and started to feel meaningless. More than once she thought about turning around. There had to be somewhere easier. A shelter in the next town, a bus station with a bench and a vending machine, a church that kept its doors unlocked. Somewhere with heat and walls that didn't move in the wind. Somewhere that didn't require walking into a forest in February with wet shoes and a bag full of nothing. But every time the thought surfaced, something in her pushed it back down. Not hope, something harder than hope, something closer to stubbornness, or maybe memory. The image of her grandfather's face, the weight of the coin in her pocket. The words he had said that didn't make sense until they had to. Easier had never worked out for her. Easier was the Felton house. Easier was pretending to belong somewhere she was tolerated. Easier was a warm room at the end of a hallway that used to be a closet and a family that fed her because a check arrived on the first of every month. She was done with easier. The forest thickened as she walked. Birch and oak gave way to heavier pines, their branches weighed down with snow. The air changed. It became sharper, cleaner, stripped of everything human, no car exhaust, no heating vents, no coffee, just cold and wood and the faint mineral smell of frozen earth. The path, what was left of it, disappeared under the snow about a mile in. But Waverly didn't stop. She had been here before, years ago, when Silas brought her to the edge of the forest on one of their long walks. He hadn't taken her inside, just stood at the tree line and looked in like he was visiting something he respected too much to disturb. I used to work out there, he told her. On the old freight line, it's still there. Everything I left behind is still there. She had thought he meant tools, maybe a lunchbox, an old coat, the kind of things men leave at job sites and never go back for. Now she realized he meant something else entirely. The trees pressed closer. The snow got deeper. Waverly's legs burned with every step, the muscles protesting against the cold and the uneven ground. Branches scratched at her jacket, her face, her hands. She stumbled once, catching herself on a trunk that left a streak of frozen bark across her palm. She kept going, not because she was brave, because she was out of alternatives. And then she saw it. The train car sat at the end of a forgotten track, a single rail line that had been decommissioned decades ago and left to rust into the earth. The rails were barely visible under the snow, just faint ridges in the white, like the bones of something long dead pressing up through the skin of the ground. The car itself was a freight box, standard gauge, 40 feet long, maybe a little less, the kind that used to carry grain or lumber or whatever else the railroads decided was worth moving from one place to another. Its walls were corrugated steel brown with rust streaked with age. The paint, whatever color it had been, was gone. The door on the left side hung open at an angle, one hinge broken, the other barely holding. Snow had piled against the base halfway up the wheels, which hadn't turned in years. Ice clung to the undercarriage in long, jagged teeth. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and through the gaps in the metal, Waverly could see the gray sky pressing in. It didn't look like shelter. It didn't look safe. It didn't look like anything a person would choose on purpose. It looked honest. That was the word that came to her standing there with her wet shoes and her aching legs and her duffel bag full of other people's decisions. Honest. Not pretending to be anything it wasn't. Not promising warmth it couldn't deliver. Not dressed up in aluminum siding and chain link fences and the illusion of stability. Just a rusted box sitting in the woods waiting for someone who had run out of better options. The wind pushed through the broken seams of the car, making the metal groan in long, uneven sounds. The noise moved through the trees like a voice that had forgotten its own language. Low, hollow. Oh. Waverly stood there for a long time, longer than made sense given the temperature. She was shivering now, not the small, manageable kind, but the deep, involuntary kind that starts in the core and works its way out to the fingertips. Then she stepped forward, gripped the edge of the open door, and pulled herself inside. The smell hit her first. Rust and damp wood and something older. Something mineral and deep, like the earth itself had been breathing inside this box for decades. It was the smell of forgetting. The smell of a place that had once served a purpose and then been left to remember that purpose alone. The interior was worse than the outside suggested. The floor was bare steel, frozen solid, covered in a thin film of frost that made every surface gleam dully in the fading light. The walls were corrugated metal with gaps between the panels where the cold slipped through like it had a right to be there. In the far corner, a section of the roof had partially collapsed, letting in a wedge of sky and a steady trickle of snow that had formed a small white mound on the floor. The air inside was not warmer than the air outside. If anything, it felt colder, the kind of cold that collects in enclosed spaces and sits there patient and absolute, like it has been waiting. Waverly dropped her bag on the floor. The sound it made was flat and empty. She looked around. No furniture, no insulation. No sign that anyone had been here in years, except for the faint marks on the floor where something heavy had once sat, drag lines in the rust that led nowhere. She pulled out the lighter she had found in the duffel bag, a cheap plastic thing with a faded logo on the side. She had gathered some dry wood on the walk-in, twigs mostly, a few pieces of bark, whatever she could carry while still holding the bag. She arranged them in a small pile near the center of the car, away from the walls the way she remembered seeing it done in a book she once read in the Feltons' living room. She flicked the lighter. Nothing, just a dry metallic click. She tried again. A spark this time small and brief gone before it touched anything. Again. Nothing. Again. The flame appeared for half a second blue and yellow, then the wind found it through one of the gaps in the wall and killed it instantly. Waverly sat back on her heels. Her hands were shaking. Not from effort. From cold and from something else she didn't want to name yet. "This isn't going to work," she said out loud. The words fell flat in the empty space, absorbed by the metal walls like they had never been spoken. She tried the lighter 3 more times. Each attempt produced less than the one before, as if the lighter itself was giving up. On the last try, the mechanism jammed and the flint wheel wouldn't turn at all. She set it down on the frozen floor and stared at it. For a full minute, she didn't move. The cold wrapped around her, tightening with every breath. She could feel it in her chest now, a hard pressing weight that made her lungs work harder than they should have. This was the moment. She recognized it the way you recognize a fork in a road you have never walked before but somehow knew was coming. She could leave, right now, before the light went completely. Before her legs got too stiff to carry her back. She could walk to the road, find the gas station, ask someone for a ride to the nearest shelter. She could be warm in 2 hours. She could be safe by nightfall. The word safe echoed in her mind, and it brought with it a long parade of rooms she had been safe in. The Felton's house, the group home before that, the temporary placements that lasted weeks or months before someone decided she wasn't the right fit. All of them safe, none of them hers. Her hand moved into her pocket. The coin was there, cold as the air around it, but familiar in a way that nothing else was. She turned it over between her fingers, feeling the worn edge, the smooth face, the small imperfection near the rim where the metal had been nicked long ago. This was all she had left of a man who hadn't given up on her. And this place, this rusted, frozen, miserable place, was the only thing that man had chosen to leave behind. Waverly exhaled slowly. The breath came out in a white cloud that hung in the air for a moment before dissolving. She put the lighter back in her pocket. She pulled her jacket tighter. She sat down on the freezing steel floor with her back against the wall, her knees drawn up, the duffel bag wedged beside her like a thin, inadequate shield. Not because she believed things would get better, but because for the first time walking away felt worse than staying. The first night passed the way bad dreams do, slowly, unevenly, with long stretches of something that wasn't quite sleep and wasn't quite waking. Waverly drifted in and out of consciousness, her body cycling between shivering and a dull, heavy numbness that felt like it belonged to someone else. She dreamed of her grandfather's porch, the creak of his recliner, the sound of freight trains passing in the distance, their horns low and long, the kind of sound that carries for miles through cold air. In the dream, Silas was sitting with his hands on his knees, looking out at nothing in particular. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The dream was just his presence, steady and warm like a fire that had been burning for a long time and didn't need tending. She woke to gray light and colder air. Morning, the snow had stopped, but the wind hadn't. It pushed through the gaps in the walls in sharp, irregular bursts, each one carrying a fine mist of ice crystals that settled on everything. Waverly stood up. Her body protested every movement. Her back ached from the steel floor. Her neck was stiff. Her feet, still in the damp sneakers, had gone from painful to numb to a dull, prickling warmth that she knew was not actually warmth. She ate one of the 2 granola bars she had found in the duffel bag. It tasted like cardboard and dust, but the sugar hit her bloodstream fast enough to take the edge off the fog in her head. Then she got to work, not because she had a plan, because standing still felt like dying. She started with the obvious problem, the collapsed section of roof. Using a piece of flat metal she found outside, she pried it away from the rest of the structure and examined the damage. The panel had rusted through along a seam weakened by years of snow and rain until it simply folded inward. Beneath it, the support beam was still intact, just exposed. She couldn't fix it properly. She didn't have tools, materials, or any real knowledge of structural repair. But she could cover it. She found a section of old tarpaulin caught in the brush near the track's frozen stuff and caked with dirt, but mostly intact. She dragged it back, wrestled it over the gap, and weighed it down with rocks and pieces of scrap metal. It wasn't good. It wasn't even close to good. But it stopped the snow from falling directly onto the floor, and that was enough to feel like progress. The second day was harder. The temperature dropped further, and the wind picked up. Waverly spent most of the morning gathering firewood, real firewood this time, not twigs and bark, but fallen branches thick enough to burn for more than a few minutes. She dragged them through the snow one at a time, her fingers raw and splitting at the knuckles, her breath coming in short, painful bursts. She tried the lighter again. It still wouldn't catch. She nearly threw it against the wall, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the memory of her grandfather's hands, the way they moved when he was fixing something slow and deliberate, never rushed, never angry at the object for being broken. He used to say that the things that don't work right aren't fighting you. They're just waiting for you to understand them. Instead, she sat down, took the lighter apart with her fingernails, cleared the ice from the flint mechanism, and put it back together. Her hands shook the entire time. The small parts slipped and fell onto the frozen floor, barely visible in the fading light. She picked them up and started over. And again. And once more after that, each time with a patience she didn't know she had, a patience that felt borrowed from someone who wasn't there anymore, but had left his steadiness behind like a second inheritance, quieter than coins, harder to lose. By the second night, she still hadn't made fire. She lay on the floor with every piece of clothing she owned layered on top of her, the duffel bag pressed against her chest like a shield, and she stared at the dark ceiling of the train car and listened to the wind argue with the walls. The cold was not something she could describe to anyone who hadn't felt it. It wasn't just temperature, it was weight. It pressed down on her from every direction, squeezed into the spaces between her clothes, and her skin settled into her joints like concrete. Her teeth chattered so hard her jaw ached. Her muscles cramped and released in cycles she couldn't control. Sometime around midnight, she started talking to herself, not words exactly, just sounds, humming, fragments of songs she half remembered from years ago. The melody her grandfather used to whistle when he was working on something in the garage. She couldn't remember the tune clearly, but the rhythm was still there, buried somewhere in the part of her brain that held on to things the rest of her had tried to forget. She survived the second night the way she had survived the first, by not dying. It was the lowest possible bar, and she cleared it by the thinnest possible margin. The third day brought the storm. It didn't arrive gradually. It didn't build. It hit the forest like a fist slamming a table. One moment the wind was steady and manageable. The next it was screaming through the trees, bending them sideways, ripping snow from the branches and hurling it in horizontal sheets that turned the air white. The train car shook, not swayed, shook. The metal walls vibrated with every gust, producing a deep resonant hum that Waverly could feel in her sternum. The tarpaulin she had secured over the roof was torn away in the first 10 minutes, disappearing into the storm like a bird that had been startled from its perch. Water came next. Melting snow pushed by the wind seeped through every crack and seam in the structure. It came in drips, at first one here, one there, small dark spots appearing on the steel floor. Then the drips became streams, thin ribbons of water that ran down the interior walls and pooled in the low spots. "Great," Waverly said, her voice tight. She grabbed the scraps she had collected, pieces of wood, a broken panel, anything with a flat surface, and tried to block the leaks. But for every one she covered, two more appeared. The storm didn't care about effort. It didn't respect determination. It just kept coming. Her hands shook, not just from the cold anymore. Something else was creeping in, something she had been holding back since the moment she walked out the Feltons' front door. Doubt. This wasn't survival. This was barely holding on. She was an 18-year-old girl in a rusted train car in the middle of a forest in February with no fire, no food worth mentioning, no tools, and no one who knew or cared where she was. "What am I even doing here?" she said out loud. And the words didn't pass through her mind the way thoughts usually did, there one moment and gone the next. They stayed. They hung in the frozen air like a sentence written on glass. She could leave, right now, before things got worse, before she became another statistic, another story that started with potential and ended with a paragraph in a local newspaper that no one would read twice. The dripping grew louder, steady, rhythmic, mocking. Waverly kicked the nearest floorboard, hard, more out of frustration than intention. The wood was old and rotted soft with decades of moisture, and her foot went partially through it. She stumbled, caught herself, and looked down. The board had shifted, cracked along its length, revealing a dark space beneath. She paused. The storm screamed outside, but inside, for just a moment, everything went quiet in her head. She crouched down and pulled at the broken board. It resisted, then gave way with a dull, wet snap. Beneath it was a shallow compartment, recessed into the frame of the car, hidden between the floor and the steel undercarriage. The space was no larger than a shoebox lined with something dark and fibrous that might have once been cloth, and inside it, nestled carefully, was a small metal box. Waverly's breathing slowed. She reached in and lifted it out. The box was heavy for its size, cold against her fingers, but solid in a way that nothing else in the train car was. The latch was stiff with corrosion, but not locked. She worked it open with her thumbnail, the metal grinding against itself until it released with a soft click. Inside, arranged in fitted rows on a piece of aged velvet, was a collection of coins. Not modern coins, not quarters and dimans, and the kind of change you find between couch cushions. These were old, different sizes, different metals, different markings. Some were silver, some were copper. A few had a dull golden sheen that suggested something more valuable than their appearance let on. Each one sat in its own small depression in the velvet, held in place by the precise shape of the space cut for it. Waverly stared at them. Her mind, which had been spinning with cold and doubt, and the noise of the storm, went suddenly completely still. Beneath the coins, folded once and pressed flat against the bottom of the box, was a letter. She knew before she unfolded it. She knew from the paper, yellowed and soft at the edges. She knew from the handwriting, the careful, deliberate strokes of a man who had spent his life working with his hands and wrote each letter like he was setting a rivet. She knew because her chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "If you found this," the letter began, "it means you stayed." Waverly swallowed. The storm hammered the walls. Water dripped from the ceiling onto her shoulder. She didn't move. "I couldn't give you much. Not a perfect home, not an easy life, but I hoped I could give you something honest." Her grip on the paper tightened. Her vision blurred and she blinked hard fast, refusing to let the tears fall because some part of her was afraid that if she started crying now in this place, she might not stop. Real value is almost always hidden in places people ignore, in things they throw away, in people they overlook. "If you understand that you'll be okay." She read the last line 3 times before she could breathe normally again. "You were never scrap metal, Waverly. You never were." The last line broke something open in her that she had kept sealed for a very long time. Not since the day Silas died. Not since the car pulled away from his house when she was 9. Longer. Since before she had words for what loss felt like, back when it was just a shape in her chest that she didn't know how to name. She pressed the letter against her knee and held it there, breathing through her mouth, because her nose was running and her eyes were burning, and the storm outside was so loud that no one would have heard her even if she screamed. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she just breathed, in and out, until the tightness in her throat loosened enough to swallow. Then she lowered the letter and looked at the coins. They gleamed faintly in the gray light, each one a small, quiet testament to patience. To a man who had spent years collecting what others discarded and seeing worth where no one else bothered to look. Then she noticed it. In the bottom right corner of the collection, there was an empty slot. A small depression in the velvet, the same size and shape as every other slot, but with nothing in it. The space was clean, deliberate waiting. Waverly reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver coin. She held it over the empty space. It matched perfectly. The same diameter, the same thickness, the same worn edge. The slot had been made for this coin. Her coin. The one Silas had pressed into her palm 9 years ago on a cold morning just like this one. For a long moment she sat there on the frozen floor of a rusted train car in the middle of a storm, holding a coin in one hand and a letter in the other, and she felt something shift inside her that she couldn't name but knew was permanent. This wasn't random. This wasn't luck. This wasn't an accident of geography or timing. Her grandfather had planned this. He had hidden this box knowing that one day, if everything else failed, if the stable home became unstable, if the checks stopped and the doors closed, and the world did what the world always does to the people it considers disposable, she would come here, and she would find this. Not because he believed she would need saving, but because he believed she was the kind of person who would stay. She didn't place the coin in the slot. Not yet. Instead, she closed the box, set it beside her, and reached back into the compartment. Her fingers touched paper again, smaller this time, folded tight. She pulled it out. A second piece of paper separate from the letter, older and more fragile. She unfolded it carefully, the edges soft and threatening to tear. It was a map, hand-drawn. Pencil on grid paper, the kind you buy in pads at hardware stores. The lines were precise but simple. The markings of a man who understood spatial relationships from decades of working with mechanical blueprints. The map showed the area around the train car, the track, the tree line, the ridge to the north, and marked on it in small, careful circles were 3 locations. Each one had a number beside it. 1, 2, 3. No labels, no descriptions, just positions. But the map was damaged. Water, probably from the same leaks that plagued the car, had found its way into the compartment at some point over the years. The ink had bled, the paper had swelled and dried and swelled again, warping the grid lines and smearing the markings. 2 of the 3 locations were completely illegible, their circles dissolved into faint gray smudges. Only one remained readable. Position number 2. Northeast of the train car, near what appeared to be a rock formation about half a mile into the forest. Waverly studied the map, turning it in her hands, trying to recover the lost information. But the damage was too severe. Whatever secrets positions 1 and 3 held, they were gone now, dissolved by time and water, and the slow, patient work of neglect. She folded the map carefully and placed it inside the metal box with the coins and the letter. Then she sat back against the wall. The storm still raged outside. The roof still leaked. The floor was still frozen steel. Nothing about her physical situation had changed. She was still cold, still hungry, still alone in a place that most people would consider uninhabitable. But something else had changed, something internal, something that had to do with the difference between being abandoned and being anticipated, between being forgotten and being prepared for. Silas Marin had not left her nothing. He had left her this. And the fact that there was a map, that there were other locations, other boxes, perhaps other things hidden and waiting, meant that this was not the end of what he had prepared. It was the beginning. Waverly looked at the coins. She did the math. She didn't know exactly what they were worth, but she knew old coins had value, especially to the right buyer. If she sold them all, she could get out, find a room somewhere, pay first month's rent, buy shoes that didn't leak, start over in the way that people meant when they said those words. Clean, easy, gone. But if she did that, this would be gone too. The collection would be scattered. The letter would be just paper. The empty slot would never be filled. The last thing her grandfather had chosen for her, the thing he had spent years assembling in secret, would be converted into cash and spent and forgotten the way the world always converted meaningful things into temporary ones. Waverly closed her eyes. She listened to the storm. She felt the cold in her bones and the weight of the box on her lap and the coin in her hand, warm now from the heat of her palm. Not all of it, she said quietly. The decision settled in her chest like a stone finding the bottom of a river. She would use what she needed. She would sell enough to survive, but she would not sell everything. She would not erase the last real thing she had ever been given just because the present was hard. That night, something changed. Maybe it was the decision itself, the act of choosing to keep something instead of spending it. Maybe it was the letter, the words still echoing in her mind like a hymn sung in an empty church. Maybe it was just the fact that she had been in the cold long enough for her body to stop fighting it and start adapting to it instead. Whatever the reason, the lighter worked. She hadn't done anything different. She flicked it the same way she had flicked it a dozen times before. But this time the flame caught, small, blue at the base, yellow at the tip, trembling in the draft, but holding. She lowered it to the wood. She had gathered the driest pieces she could find, arranged in a tight pyramid the way instinct told her to. The bark caught first, curling and blackening, releasing a thin line of smoke. Then the twigs, then the larger pieces, slowly, reluctantly, like they had to be convinced. The fire was small. It was weak. It flickered with every gust that found its way through the walls, and more than once it shrank to almost nothing before recovering. But it was real. Waverly sat beside it, her hands extended, her face close enough to feel the heat on her skin for the first time in 3 days. The warmth spread through her fingers, her palms, up her wrists, and into her arms. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough. But it was the difference between enduring and choosing, between surviving and beginning. The fire crackled softly. The storm continued outside, indifferent, relentless. Water still dripped from the ceiling, and the wind still found every weakness in the walls. But inside, next to the small orange glow, Waverly Marin sat with a box of old coins and a letter from a dead man and a silver coin that hadn't yet found its place. And for the first time since she stepped out of the Feltons' front door, she didn't feel like someone who had been thrown away. She felt like someone who had been found, not by another person, not by luck or charity or the kind of rescue that comes from outside, but by a choice, her own choice, made in the dark, in the cold, in the worst possible moment when every reasonable voice in her head was telling her to leave. She had stayed, and that she was beginning to understand was the only inheritance that mattered. Outside, the storm began to lose its voice, not all at once, not like a switch being thrown, but gradually the way anger fades when it realizes no one is listening. The wind softened from a scream to a moan to a whisper. The snow slowed. The gaps in the walls stopped howling and started breathing. Waverly added another piece of wood to the fire. It caught faster this time. The flames climbed higher, casting long, uneven shadows across the corrugated walls. The shadows moved like living things, stretching and folding, painting the interior of the train car in shades of amber and black. She opened the metal box again and looked at the coins, counted them. 14, not including the one in her hand. 14 small circles of metal, each one a piece of a story she would never fully know. Where had Silas found them? On what trains? In what years? Under what circumstances? Had he picked them up from the floors of freight cars during his lunch breaks? Had he spotted them wedged between floorboards while replacing a damaged panel? Had he kept them in his pocket all day, turning them over the way she turned hers before bringing them home and placing them carefully in the box? She would never know. And that was all right, because the coins were not the inheritance. The coins were evidence of the inheritance. The real thing, the thing Silas had left her, was the understanding that value does not announce itself. It does not wear a sign. It does not come with a certificate or an appraisal or a stamp of approval from people who think they know what things are worth. Value hides in rusted train cars, in worn silver coins, in 18-year-old girls that the system has decided are no longer worth funding. Waverly closed the box, set it beside the fire, and lay down on the steel floor. The metal was still cold, but the fire was close enough to make a difference. For the first time in 3 days, the shivering slowed. Her muscles unclenched. Her breathing deepened. She placed one hand on the box and the other in her pocket around the coin, and she closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would figure out which coins to sell and which to keep. Tomorrow she would start patching the roof properly. Tomorrow she would find water, find food, find a way to make this place into something that could hold a life instead of just containing a body. But tonight she rested. Not comfortably, not peacefully, not the way people rest in warm houses with locked doors and full refrigerators, and the quiet certainty that tomorrow will look more or less like today. She rested the way a person rests after making the hardest decision of their life, and realizing in the silence that follows that they would make it again. The weeks that followed were not kind, but they were honest. Waverly learned that survival is not a single decision made once in the dark. It is 1,000 small decisions made over and over, each one ordinary, each one exhausting, each one invisible to anyone who isn't the person making them. The decision to get up when the cold says stay down. The decision to walk half a mile for water when your legs feel like they belong to someone older. The decision to eat less today so there is something left for tomorrow. She sold 4 of the coins at a pawn shop in the nearest town, a 40-minute walk south along a county road that hadn't been plowed in weeks. The man behind the counter was heavy and bored, with glasses that sat crooked on his nose, and a television behind him playing a game show with the sound turned low. He looked at the coins the way people look at things they don't understand but know are worth more than nothing. 50 each for these 2, he said, holding up a pair of copper pieces. 80 for the silver one, and this one, he turned the 4th coin under a desk lamp, squinting. 110, maybe. I'm being generous. He wasn't being generous. Waverly knew that. She could see it in the way his eyes moved, the small calculation happening behind them, the distance between what he was offering and what he thought they were worth. But she didn't have the luxury of negotiation. She didn't have a phone to look up prices. She didn't have time to find a better buyer. She had a leaking roof and empty hands and a body that was running on less than it needed. She took the money, $290, added to what remained of the original 121. It gave her enough to buy what she needed without selling anything else. For now. Walking out of that pawn shop was harder than walking into it, not because of the transaction, because of what it represented. Each coin she sold was a piece of something Silas had spent years building, a piece of his patience, a piece of the quiet, methodical love he had poured into collecting things the world discarded. She could feel the weight of the remaining coins in the box back at the train car, and she made herself a promise standing on the cracked sidewalk of that small mine. With the bills folded in her pocket, she would sell only what she had to. Not a coin more. The rest would stay. The rest was not currency. The rest was legacy. She bought a proper lighter, a tarp, a coil of wire, nails. A small hand saw that the hardware store clerk sold her for $12 because the handle was cracked. She bought canned food enough to last 2 weeks if she was careful. A box of matches as backup. A roll of duct tape. She bought a wool blanket from a thrift store thick and rough and smelling faintly of someone else's house. The woman at the register looked at her for a moment too long, the kind of look that people give when they're trying to decide whether to ask a question they already know the answer to. She didn't ask. Waverly paid and left. She carried it all back to the train car in 2 trips, each one taking most of a day. And then she went to work. The roof came first. She stripped away the damaged panels, working with the handsaw and a flat piece of scrap metal she used as a pry bar. The rust came off in flakes that stained her hands orange. Beneath the corroded exterior, the support beams were still solid, old-growth timber that had been treated with something that kept the rot at bay even after decades of exposure. She laid the tarp over the gap and secured it with wire, threading it through holes she punched with a nail, pulling it tight so the wind couldn't get underneath. It wasn't pretty. It looked like what it was. A patch. A temporary fix applied by someone who didn't know what she was doing but refused to accept that as a reason not to do it. But when the next rain came 2 days later, the floor stayed dry. The walls were harder. The gaps between the panels let in cold air in a dozen places, and no amount of stuffing or covering could seal them completely. Waverly spent 3 days gathering fallen wood from the forest, cutting it to length and wedging it into the gaps from the inside. She packed moss and dead leaves into the remaining spaces, then covered everything with strips of bark held in place with wire. The result was ugly, uneven, the kind of thing that would make a carpenter wince, but the drafts diminished. The temperature inside, which had hovered just above freezing on good days, began to climb. Not to comfortable, not to warm, but to livable. And livable, Waverly was learning, was a category she had previously underestimated. The stove was her best work. She built it from a section of steel pipe she found half buried near the old tracks, about 18 inches in diameter and 3 feet long. She set it on a base of flat stones, cut an opening in one end for feeding wood, and ran a smaller pipe through the wall to vent the smoke. The joints leaked. The draw was inconsistent. On windy days, smoke filled the car, and she had to open the door to breathe. But on calm nights, the stove held a fire for 6 hours straight. 6 hours of heat radiating from the metal, warming the floor, warming the walls, warming the air, until it felt almost human inside. Almost like a place where a person was supposed to be. She mounted the silver coin above the stove, not on a shelf, not in a frame, just a nail driven into the wall at eye level with the coin hanging from a loop of wire. It caught the firelight in the evenings, reflecting it back in a small, steady gleam that moved when the flames moved, like a second heartbeat in the room. It wasn't decoration, it was orientation, a fixed point in a world that had given her very few. By the time the worst of winter settled into something steady, the train car had changed. Not transformed, not renovated, changed. The way a face changes when it stops being afraid. The bones were the same, the structure was the same, but something in its expression had shifted. The wind still came, but it no longer owned the interior. The cold still pressed, but it met resistance now. And at the center of it all, the fire burned. Waverly had lost weight. Her clothes hung differently. Her hands, which had been soft in the way that indoor hands are soft, were now rough and cracked. The knuckles permanently reddened, the nails short and chipped. She moved differently too. Faster in some ways, slower in others. Efficient, deliberate. The movements of a person who has learned that energy is currency and every motion costs something. She didn't feel proud of what she had done. Pride was a luxury that required an audience and she had none. What she felt was something closer to alignment, like a gear that had been loose for a long time and finally found its teeth. Then the door opened. It was a Tuesday, late afternoon. The light was going gray the way it does in winter when the sun gives up early and lets the clouds take over. Waverly was inside feeding the stove when the door swung open without warning. No knock, no call, just the scrape of metal on metal and a rush of cold air. A girl stood in the doorway. She was about 17. Thin in the way that hunger makes people thin, not just the body, but the face, the eyes. Everything sharpened down to edges. Her hair was dark and chopped short, uneven, like she had cut it herself with whatever was available. She wore a jacket 2 sizes too big, the sleeves pushed up past her wrists and boots that didn't match, one brown, one black, both held together with duct tape. Her shoulders were tense. Her jaw was set. Her eyes moved around the interior of the train car in quick assessing sweeps, cataloging everything: the stove, the supplies, the exits, the girl standing by the fire. Everything about her said she was ready to leave before anyone could tell her to. "You live here?" she asked. Her voice was flat, not hostile but not friendly either. Guarded. The voice of someone who had learned to speak without revealing anything. "Yeah," Waverly said. She didn't move, didn't step forward, didn't step back. The girl looked at her for a long moment. Then she stepped inside anyway. Her name was Jessamine Thorne. She went by Jess. She didn't volunteer the name right away. It came out on the second day, dropped into a silence like a coin into a well without ceremony. Jess had run from a group home in a town 60 miles south. She didn't talk about why not at first, and Waverly didn't ask. But the details surfaced anyway, the way details always do when people share a small space. A comment about locked doors, a flinch when the wind slammed something shut, the way she slept facing the exit, one arm outside the blanket like she needed to be ready. The group home had been bad, not in the way that makes the news, in the quieter way, the way that leaves marks on the inside where no one checks. Jess had been the smallest girl there. She had been the newest. She had been the one the others decided to test, and the staff had been the kind of people who call cruelty a phase and tell you to toughen up. She had toughened up, and then she had left. The first few days with Jess in the train car were difficult. Not dangerous, difficult. Jess tested everything. She took more food than her share from the canned supplies. She left the door open at night, letting the cold flood in, and when Waverly got up to close it, Jess watched from her corner with a look that was equal parts defiance and curiosity. She made comments, sharp ones, designed to provoke. "Nice place, real cozy. You decorate it yourself. Is that supposed to be a stove? Looks like a pipe someone threw away. You actually chose to live here, like on purpose." Waverly didn't react. Not because she didn't hear the edge in the words, because she did. She heard the edge, and she heard what was underneath it. Fear. The particular kind of fear that disguises itself as aggression because vulnerability has never been safe. Jess was not trying to hurt her. Jess was trying to find the limit, the line, the moment when Waverly would turn and say what every other person in Jess's life had eventually said: "Get out. You're too much. I can't deal with you." Waverly knew because she recognized the strategy. She had used a version of it herself years ago in the Felton house. Not as loud, not as sharp, but the same basic mechanism. Push until you get rejected, because rejection you cause is easier to survive than rejection that surprises you. So she didn't push back. She closed the door when Jess left it open. She divided the food evenly and didn't mention the difference. She answered the sharp comments with silence, or with something so plain it gave nothing to push against. "The stove works," she said once when Jess made another comment about it. "That's all it needs to do." Jess didn't know what to do with that. You could see it in her face, the brief confusion of someone who threw a punch and hit air. The breaking point came on the fifth evening. Waverly was sitting by the stove reading the letter from her grandfather for the third time. She had developed a habit of reading it in the evenings, not because she needed to see the words again, but because the act of holding the paper and seeing the handwriting made the train car feel less empty. She kept the letter in the metal box with the remaining coins, and the box stayed beside the stove within arm's reach. The silver coin hung on the wall above, catching the firelight. Jess was moving around the car, restless. She had been restless all day, pacing, picking things up and putting them down, the energy of someone who can't sit still because sitting still means thinking. She passed the stove. Her elbow caught the coin, or her hand. The motion was quick, but not quite quick enough to be accidental. The wire loop slipped off the nail and the coin fell. It hit the steel floor with a sharp, bright ring that cut through the room like a bell struck in an empty church. The sound hung in the air. Jess froze. Just for half a second. Just long enough to reveal that the motion had been deliberate. A test. The final test. The one designed to answer the only question that mattered. What do you do when I break something you care about? Waverly stood up. She walked over, crouched down, and picked up the coin. She turned it over in her fingers, checking it. The metal was fine. The wire loop had bent, but not broken. She straightened it and hung the coin back on the nail and stepped back. Then she looked at Jess. "If you want to stay," she said, her voice calm but firm, carrying no anger and no negotiation. "You don't have to break things to prove a point." Jess didn't respond. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes dropped to the floor. She stood there, caught between the urge to leave and the need to stay, and for a moment the only sound was the fire and the wind. She stayed. Not because Waverly had won an argument. There was no argument. She stayed because something had happened that she didn't expect. She had pushed, and instead of being pushed out, she had been seen. Not excused, not pitied, seen. And that, for a girl who had spent her whole life being looked through, was enough to change the direction of an evening, and then a day, and then a week. What grew between them was not friendship in any conventional sense. It was something raw. Something that didn't have a name because neither of them had ever experienced it before. Two girls in a rusted train car learning to exist in the same space without performing, without defending, without waiting for the other shoe to drop. Jess still had sharp edges. Waverly still kept things close. But the distance between them shrank, measured not in words, but in small, accumulated acts of trust. Jess started closing the door at night without being asked. Waverly started leaving extra food where Jess could reach it without having to ask. Neither of them acknowledged these gestures. They didn't need to. Jess didn't apologize. Waverly didn't expect her to. But the test stopped. The comments softened. The door stayed closed at night. And slowly, so slowly that neither of them could have pointed to the exact moment it happened, the space inside the train car began to hold two people instead of one. Ridley Cobb arrived 8 days after Jess. He didn't push the door open. He didn't knock. He was just there one morning, sitting on the ground outside the train car with his back against the wheel, his knees pulled to his chest, his head down. He was 15, small for his age, pale in the way that suggests time spent indoors, not by choice but by circumstance. He wore a sweatshirt with no jacket, jeans that were too short, and shoes with no laces. His hands were raw, his lips were cracked. He looked like he had been walking for a long time and had simply stopped here because his body refused to go any further. Waverly saw him when she went out to gather wood. She stopped. He didn't look up. "Hey," she said. Nothing. No movement, no acknowledgement. She crouched down a few feet away, keeping distance. "Are you hurt?" A small shake of the head, almost imperceptible. "You want to come inside? There's a fire." A pause, then the smallest nod she had ever seen. She held the door open for him. He walked in without looking at her, found the corner farthest from the stove, and sat down with his back against the wall. He drew his knees up again, wrapped his arms around them, and went still. Like a stone. Like something that had decided that the safest thing it could be was small. He didn't speak. Not that day, not the next, not the day after that. He ate when food was placed near him. He slept in the corner, curled tight, his breathing shallow and irregular. He flinched at sudden noises, the clang of wood against the stove, the snap of a branch outside the scrape of the door. Each time his whole body tensed, his eyes widened, and then slowly he forced himself to relax. Waverly didn't push. She didn't ask questions. She didn't try to coax him into conversation or draw him out with kindness that he wasn't ready to receive. She just made space. Physical space. Emotional space. The kind of space that says you are allowed to be here without being required to explain why. Jess was less patient. She watched Ridley with a kind of frustrated protectiveness, the way someone watches a wounded animal they want to help, but don't know how to approach. He hasn't said a word in 3 days, Jess told Waverly one evening when Ridley was asleep. I know. Doesn't that bother you? No. Why not? Waverly added a log to the fire and watched the sparks rise. Because he's still here. That's enough for now. Jess looked at her for a long moment, then looked at Ridley's sleeping form, and something in her expression changed, softened, like a wall developing its first crack. The night Ridley disappeared was the coldest night of the month. The wind had been building all day, a deep sustained pressure that made the walls of the train car hum like a struck tuning fork. By evening, the temperature had dropped past the point where the stove could compensate. Frost formed on the inside of the walls delicate white patterns that would have been beautiful in any other context. Waverly woke in the middle of the night to silence, not the silence of calm, the silence of absence. She looked at Ridley's corner. Empty. His blanket was there crumpled. His shoes were gone. The door was open. A thin blade of wind cut across the floor. Jess. Waverly's voice was low controlled. Jess sat up immediately alert. She followed Waverly's eyes to the empty corner and the open door. When Jess asked, I don't know, stay here. I'm coming with you. Stay here, keep the fire going. If we both leave and it goes out, we come back to nothing. Jess didn't like it. Waverly could see that. But she understood the logic, and logic was the language Jess trusted most. She nodded her jaw tight and moved to the stove. Waverly grabbed her jacket and stepped outside. The cold was vicious. Not just cold, violent, the kind of cold that doesn't wait for you to adjust. That takes whatever warmth you carried out the door and strips it away in seconds. The wind drove ice crystals into her face, and the snow on the ground was crusted hard enough to hold her weight for a step before cracking and dropping her shin deep. She didn't call his name. Ridley was not the kind of person who would respond to a shout in the dark. If anything, it would drive him further away. Instead, she walked, step by step, methodical, checking the obvious paths. The trail to the water source, the area near the woodpile, the clearing where the tracks curved north. She found him behind a fallen oak about 200 yards from the train car. He was sitting on the ground, his back against the trunk, his knees pulled up, his arms wrapped around himself. He was shaking, not from cold alone, from something deeper, something that starts inside and works its way to the surface. He was trying to make himself small enough to disappear. Waverly had seen this before, not in another person, in herself, the nights at the Felton house when she would curl into the corner of the closet room and pull the blanket over her head and pretend that if she got small enough, the world would forget she was there and stop asking her to be grateful for things that weren't enough. The impulse wasn't about hiding from danger. It was about hiding from the unbearable weight of being a person that no one had chosen. She stopped a few feet away. She didn't crouch down. She didn't reach out. She didn't say, "Are you okay?" because the answer was obvious, and asking obvious questions is just another way of telling someone you don't know what to do. She sat down next to him, on the frozen ground, in the wind, in the dark. She pulled her jacket tighter and she waited. Minutes passed. The wind screamed through the branches above them, shaking loose cascades of snow that fell in quiet thuds around them. The cold seeped through the ground, through her clothes, into her bones. She could feel her fingers stiffening, her feet going numb. She stayed, not because she had a strategy, not because she knew the right thing to say, because she knew what it felt like to be somewhere cold and dark and alone, and she knew that the thing she had wanted most in those moments was not advice or comfort or someone telling her it would be okay. It was just another person, sitting there, choosing not to leave. After a long time, Ridley shifted, just slightly. His shoulder moved toward hers, not touching, almost touching. The smallest possible gesture of trust from a boy who had learned that proximity usually meant pain. Waverly didn't move. She let the distance close at his speed. His shoulder touched hers, light as a leaf falling on water. They sat like that for a while. Two people in the dark leaning into each other, saying nothing, while the forest raged around them. Then Waverly stood up. She didn't offer her hand. She just started walking back toward the train car slowly, and after a moment she heard footsteps behind her, small and certain but following. When they reached the door, Jess was standing inside with her arms crossed, her face tight, with a worry she would never admit to. She looked at Ridley. She looked at Waverly. She didn't say anything. She just moved aside and let them in. Ridley went to his corner. He pulled the blanket around himself and settled in. But something was different. His shoulders were lower. His breathing was slower. And when Jess put a cup of warm water near him, heated over the stove, he reached for it without flinching. That night before he slept, Ridley spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper, rough from disuse, cracked at the edges like old paper. "There's a man," he said, "in the trees. I've seen him. He watches this place." Waverly looked at Jess. Jess looked back. The fire popped. Outside, the wind continued its long, formless argument with the forest. "What forest?" "How many times?" Waverly asked, keeping her voice steady. "3, maybe 4. She nodded. She didn't press for more. But she lay awake that night with her hand on the metal box and her eyes on the door, listening to sounds she hadn't paid attention to before. 2 days later, Waverly followed the map. She left at dawn when the light was flat and gray and the forest was quiet in the way it gets between storms. She told Jess she was scouting for more wood, which was partially true. She didn't mention the map. She didn't want to explain something she wasn't sure she understood herself. The route to position number 2 led northeast through a denser section of forest where the pines grew close together and the snow was thinner under the canopy. The terrain rose slightly enough to make her legs work harder, and after 20 minutes she hit a low ridge of exposed rock that ran roughly east to west. The rock formation on the map was easy to identify once she was close. A cluster of boulders stacked against the base of the ridge, one of them split down the middle by frost, creating a narrow crevice about 2 feet wide and 4 feet deep. She squeezed in. The space smelled like wet stone and dead leaves and something metallic. At the back, wedged between the rock and the frozen ground, was another box, smaller than the first. Tin, not steel. The lid was corroded but intact. Inside, she found more coins, 6 of them. These were different from the others, older, heavier, with markings she didn't recognize. One of them, a large silver piece with an eagle on one side and a woman's profile on the other, felt significant in her hand in a way she couldn't explain. Like it was the kind of coin that people wrote about in books, about things that people collect. Beneath the coins was a notebook, small, pocket-sized, with a brown leather cover that had darkened with age. The pages were yellowed but legible, filled with her grandfather's handwriting. Waverly sat on the cold stone and read. The notebook was not a diary. It was closer to a log. Dates, locations, brief descriptions, entries that spanned years. April 14th, car 7741, found under coupling plate, Mercury dime 1916, good condition. September 2nd, car 8803, wedged in floor seam near door, Indian head penny, date worn, still worth keeping. January 19th, car 6622, fell out during panel replacement, walking Liberty half, beautiful. Entry after entry, dozens of them. Each one recording a coin found during his work on the freight line, each one noting the car number, the location within the car, the type of coin and its condition. It was a record of a man who spent decades crawling through the insides of freight cars, replacing broken panels and rusted bolts, and who had noticed what everyone else had missed. Coins that had fallen from pockets. Coins that had slipped through floorboards. Coins that had been dropped or forgotten or discarded by the thousands of anonymous people who had loaded and unloaded cargo on those trains over the past century. Small, worthless things that accumulated in the cracks and seams of machines that moved ceaselessly across a continent. Silas had collected them all, not because they were valuable, although some of them were, because they were overlooked, because the world had decided they were debris and Silas had disagreed. There was something in those entries that went beyond collecting. It was devotion. The same kind of devotion that a man puts into building a fence post by post, or maintaining an engine that no one else thinks is worth saving, or showing up to the same job for 30 years and doing it well every single day, even when no one notices. Silas had found meaning in the invisible work, in the picking up of small things, in the patient, unglamorous act of paying attention to what others stepped over. Waverly understood now why he had been the way he was, quiet, unhurried, content with small things. He hadn't been a man without ambition. He had been a man whose ambition was aimed at something most people couldn't see. Near the back of the notebook, the entries changed. The dates became less frequent. The handwriting, which had always been precise, became slightly unsteady. The last entry was dated 3 weeks before Silas died. For Waverly, she was never debris either. She closed the notebook and sat in the cold stone crevice for a long time. The wind moved through the trees above her, carrying the sound of branches rubbing together, a sound like old bones settling. This was the last time her grandfather would speak to her. She understood that now. The letter in the train car had been his heart. This notebook was his mind, and both of them said the same thing in different languages. I saw you. I always saw you, and I left you everything I could. She tucked the notebook and the coins into her jacket, climbed out of the crevice, and walked back to the train car. From that point forward, every decision she made was hers alone. Ray Sutter arrived on a morning that started like any other. Waverly was outside splitting wood when she heard the footsteps. Not the light, uncertain steps of someone lost. Heavy, deliberate. The footsteps of someone who knew where he was going. He came through the tree line from the south. A man somewhere around 50, maybe older, hard to tell, because the years had been unkind and he wore them like weather. Tall, but stooped. Thin in the way that suggests choices rather than circumstances. His face was long and lined with deep creases around the mouth and eyes that had seen too much of something and not enough of something else. He wore a canvas jacket, work boots, and a knit cap pulled low. His hands hung at his sides loose but not relaxed. He walked with the kind of confidence that doesn't ask permission. He stopped 10 feet from Waverly and looked at the train car. Then he looked at her. Well, he said, and the word came out slow, drawn out like he was tasting it. Someone's been busy. Waverly set down the handsaw. She didn't pick up anything else. Can I help you? Maybe. He smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind that arranges the face without involving the eyes. I knew the man who used to own this car, Silas Marin. Worked with him on the line years back. He ever mention a Ray Sutter? Waverly's expression didn't change. No. No. He repeated the word like he was filing it somewhere. That's fine. Silas was private, kept things close. I respected that. But I also knew what he was doing out here. The coins, the collecting. He wasn't as subtle as he thought. He took a step closer. Waverly held her ground. I'm not here to cause trouble, he said, though the way he said it made trouble feel like something he kept in his back pocket. I just think there's enough to share. Silas and I work the same line. I found coins too back in the day. Only difference it is I spent mine. He saved his. He gestured at the train car. And now here you are, sitting on the savings. They're not savings, Waverly said. They're mine. He left them to me. Left them, Sutter's eyebrows rose. He leave you a will, a deed, something with a notary stamp on it. Silence, that's what I thought. He looked at the train car again, longer this time. Look, I'm not unreasonable. I don't want all of it. I just want what's fair. Half seems right. We can work this out friendly. There's nothing to work out, Waverly said. This is my grandfather's property. His things, his train car. You can leave. Sutter's smile faded. Not quickly. It left slowly the way light leaves a room when clouds move in. What replaced it wasn't anger exactly. It was something colder. The expression of a man who is accustomed to getting what he wants and has run out of patience for the methods that don't involve force. I'll give you some time to think about it, he said. Then he turned and walked back into the trees. He came back 2 days later. This time he didn't talk. Waverly returned from gathering water to find the tarp torn from the roof. Not blown off by wind, torn. The wire she had used to secure it was cut in 3 places, clean cuts that no storm could produce. The tarp lay crumpled on the ground beside the train car, and one of the wall panels she had reinforced with wood had been pried loose, the nails pulled out and scattered in the snow. Inside, Jess was standing by the stove with a piece of firewood in her hand like a weapon. Ridley was in his corner, pressed flat against the wall, his eyes wide. Someone was on the roof, Jess said. Her voice was tight, controlled. I heard the cutting. I went outside, but he was already gone. Waverly looked at the damage. A week of work undone in minutes. The cold was already finding its way back in through the gaps, reclaiming the ground she had fought so hard to hold. She thought about the coins, about selling all of them, giving Sutter his half, buying peace. It would be easier. It would end this before it became something worse. Then she looked at the silver coin hanging above the stove, and she heard her grandfather's voice in the back of her mind. Not the words from the letter, not the entries from the notebook, just his voice the way it sounded on the porch in the evening, calm and low and certain. Real value is almost always hidden in places people ignore. "We fix it," Waverly said. "And when he comes back," Jess asked. "We're still here." Sutter came back 3 days later. This time all three of them were outside. Waverly on the roof securing the new tarp, Jess stacking wood against the wall, Ridley sitting on the steps of the train car watching the tree line with the steady, unblinking attention of someone who has spent a long time learning to see danger before it arrives. Sutter stopped at the edge of the clearing. He looked at the three of them. He hadn't expected more than one. Waverly climbed down from the roof. She held the notebook in one hand open to a specific page. "This is my grandfather's logbook," she said. Her voice carried across the clearing, clear and level. "Every coin in that collection is documented. Date found, location, car number. His name is on every page. This is his train car. These are his things, and I am his granddaughter." She paused, let the words settle. "You have no claim. You have no documentation. You have nothing except the fact that you worked alongside a man who was smarter than you and saved what you spent. That's not a debt. That's a regret. And it's yours to carry, not mine." Sutter stared at her. His jaw worked. Something passed behind his eyes, something that might have been shame in a different man, but in him looked more like the recalculation of odds. "You think a notebook means anything," he said, but the edge in his voice had dulled. The conviction was leaking out of him like air from a tire. "Think it means more than nothing," Waverly said, "and I think you know that." She held the notebook steady. The pages fluttered in the wind, each one covered in Silas's precise handwriting, each one a record of something found and kept and valued. She wasn't bluffing. She didn't need to. The truth has a particular weight to it. Heavier than threats, heavier than the bluster of men who have spent their lives taking what isn't theirs. Jess stepped forward, the piece of firewood still in her hand, not raised but present. She stood slightly behind Waverly and to the left close enough to matter. Ridley stood up from the steps. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He was the smallest person there, the youngest, the quietest, but he stood straight and he didn't look away. And there is something in that kind of quiet courage that unnerves people who rely on intimidation. His presence was enough. Three people standing in the cold, refusing to move. Sutter looked at them for a long time. The wind blew. Snow fell from a branch somewhere behind him with a soft, heavy thud. Then he turned and walked away. He didn't come back quietly. On his way through the clearing, he kicked the wood pile, logs scattered across the snow. He grabbed one of the wall panels leaning against the train car and threw it into the trees. He put his boot through a bucket Waverly had been using to collect water, crushing it flat. Small destructions, the tantrum of a man who lost a fight he thought he had already won. Then he was gone. The forest swallowed him and the clearing went quiet. Jess exhaled. It was the first time Waverly had seen her let go of tension voluntarily. Ridley sat back down on the steps, his shoulders dropping an inch, and looked up at Waverly with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Trust, not the fragile, conditional kind. The kind that forms when you watch someone stand in front of a threat and choose not to run. They rebuilt the woodpile. They retrieved the wall panel from the trees. They found another bucket in the scrap near the tracks, dented but functional. It took 3 days to repair what Sutter had damaged. This time they did it together. Jess held the panels while Waverly nailed them. Ridley carried wood from the forest more than they needed, stacking it high against the wall like a barricade made of preparation. He worked without speaking, but there was something different in how he moved. A purpose, a deliberateness. Like he had decided that this place was worth his effort, and that decision had unlocked something in him that silence had been keeping sealed. Waverly watched them work and felt something she had no framework for. She had spent her whole life being a guest in other people's spaces, adjusting to their rules, their moods, their willingness to tolerate her. She had never been the one who built the space. She had never been the one other people adjusted onto. It was strange and uncomfortable and good in a way that made her throat tighten if she thought about it too directly. So she didn't think about it. She just kept working. On the third evening, when the work was done and the fire was burning steady, Waverly sat by the stove and opened her grandfather's notebook to the last page. She read the final entry one more time. For Waverly, she was never debris either. She closed the notebook and set it in the metal box with the pins and the letter. Then she looked at Jess, who was sitting across the fire with her knees drawn up, staring into the flames with an expression that was no longer guarded. And at Ridley, who had fallen asleep in his corner, but closer to the stove, now closer to the center, his blanket pulled up to his chin and his breathing steady and deep. The train car was quieter than it had been in weeks. The wind outside had softened to a low murmur. The roof held, the walls held, the fire held, and for the first time since she had started building this place, Waverly realized she wasn't just building shelter. She was building something she had never had before and had stopped believing she ever would. She was building a place where people stayed. Not because they had to, not because a check arrived, not because someone signed a paper, because they chose to, because something here in this rusted, patched, imperfect place was worth choosing. Waverly leaned back against the wall and closed her eyes. The fire crackled. The metal groaned softly as the coal pressed against the outside. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called a single low note that hung in the air like a question that already knew its answer. She didn't think about Ray Sutter. She didn't think about the Feltons. She didn't think about the years behind her or the uncertainty ahead. She thought about her grandfather just for a moment, the creak of his recliner, the weight of his hand on her shoulder, the way he looked at old, broken, forgotten things and saw something the rest of the world had missed. Then she let the thought go the way you release a breath you have been holding for too long, and she rested. Not because the danger was over, it wasn't. Not because the future was certain, it couldn't be. But because tonight, right now, in this moment, the fire was burning, and the roof was holding, and two other people were breathing in the same space, and that was enough. That was more than enough. 2 years passed the way seasons pass in places that don't keep calendars. Not in days or weeks or months, but in changes. The color of the light through the trees, the thickness of ice on the creek, the way the wind shifted from something that attacked to something that simply arrived, the way the footpath between the train car and the water source deepened from a faint depression in the snow to a worn track in the earth, packed firm by the same boots walking the same route hundreds of times. Waverly was 20 years old now, and the train car had become something that the word shelter could no longer contain. It was still rusted, still corrugated steel, still sitting on a set of forgotten tracks in a forest that most people had no reason to enter. But it had been changed by the same force that changes all things when enough time and enough stubbornness are applied to them. The roof no longer leaked. Waverly had replaced the tarp twice, then abandoned it entirely in favor of overlapping steel panels salvaged from a collapsed equipment shed she found a mile north along the old rail line. The panels were mismatched, different gauges, different levels of rust, but she had fitted them together with a precision that surprised even her, bending the edges with a hammer and sealing the seams with a tar compound she mixed from pine resin and ash. The technique wasn't in any book. She had figured it out through trial and error, the way her grandfather must have figured out 1,000 things on those freight trains, by paying attention, by trying again. The walls were insulated now, not with fiberglass or foam or anything manufactured, with layers. Wood on the inside packed moss and dried leaves and the gap-spark shingles on the outside overlapping like scales. It wasn't beautiful. A building inspector would have had concerns, but it held heat, and in the deep cold of a northern winter, holding heat is the only aesthetic that matters. The stove had been rebuilt. Larger now with a flat-top surface where a pot could sit and a proper chimney that drew smoke up and out instead of letting it pool along the ceiling. Waverly had figured out the draft problem by studying how the wind moved around the car, where it hit hardest, where it swirled, and she had positioned the chimney exit at the precise point where the natural airflow would pull the smoke upward. It worked, not perfectly on every day, but well enough that the interior no longer smelled like a campfire. It smelled like a home that happened to have a fire in it. The silver coins still hung above the stove. Same nail, same wire loop, though the wire had been replaced once when the original rusted through. The coin caught the firelight the same way it always had, that small, steady gleam that pulsed with the flames like a heartbeat made visible. Jess had changed too, though she would have denied it if you pointed it out directly. The sharp edges were still there. The quick tongue, the guarded posture, the instinct to scan every room for exits. Those things don't disappear. They are survival architecture, built over years, and tearing them down would be as dangerous as building them was necessary. But something had softened beneath them. Not the edges themselves, but the space between them. The pauses where she used to attack were now pauses where she listened. The silences that used to feel like loaded weapons now felt like resting places. She had taken over the maintenance of the woodpile, not because anyone asked her to, but because she had noticed that Waverly's hands were cracked and bleeding from the saw, and one morning the wood was just there, cut and stacked, and neither of them said a word about it. She had also started talking about the future, which was new. Not grand plans, not dreams, small practical things. Whether they could build a second room onto the train car when spring came, whether the creek was clean enough to use year-round, or if they needed to find a deeper source, whether it was worth walking to town to look for work when the weather broke. These were the words of someone who intended to be somewhere tomorrow. For Jess, that was a revolution. Ridley had changed the most, though the changes were the quietest. He spoke now. Not often, not at length. But when he did, the words were considered chosen with the care of someone who had learned that speech is not something to waste. He was taller, still thin, still pale, but no longer the contracted, flinching boy who had appeared outside the train car with no laces in his shoes. He stood straighter. He looked at people when they talked to him. He slept in the center of the car now, not in the corner, and he slept through the night without waking his breathing deep, and even the breathing of someone who has stopped expecting the worst to happen while they rest. He had developed a habit of sitting on the steps of the train car in the late afternoon when the light came through the trees at a low angle and turned everything gold. He would sit there and watch the forest and not say anything, and there was a peacefulness in his stillness that hadn't been there before. For his silence was a shield. Now it was a choice. One afternoon he turned to Waverly and said something that stopped her in the middle of stacking firewood. "This is the longest I've stayed anywhere." She looked at him. He wasn't smiling, but his face was open, unguarded, the way faces are when they are saying something true and not worrying about how it lands. "Me too," she said. He nodded. That was all. He turned back to the trees and she went back to the wood, and the moment passed. But it stayed with her the way certain moments do, the ones that are too small to be called events, but too heavy to be called nothing. They were not a family. Waverly was careful about that word, careful not to use it even in her own mind, because she knew what happened to families. They dissolved. They made promises and broke them. They held you close until holding you became expensive, and then they set you down and walked away. What they were was something she didn't have a word for. Three people who had ended up in the same rusted box for different reasons, and discovered that the box held more when it held all of them. Three people who had stopped running and found that the thing they were running toward had been right here the whole time, not behind a door, in a house with a mailbox in a yard, but in the act of staying. In the daily, unglamorous, exhausting work of choosing to be somewhere on purpose. They had developed routines, not rules, routines. The distinction mattered. Rules were imposed. Routines grew organically, shaped by the needs of the space and the people in it. Waverly rose first before dawn and got the fire going. Jess handled the wood and the water. Ridley swept the floor and maintained the perimeter, checking the walls and the roof for new damage, with a methodical patience that reminded Waverly, sometimes painfully, of her grandfather. They ate together in the evenings, not because anyone declared it a tradition, because the stove was warmest then and the firelight was brightest, and it turned out that sitting in the same circle of warmth at the end of a hard day was not something any of them wanted to do alone. Winter came back the same way it always did, quiet, heavy, and unapologetic. The first real snow fell in early November, a wet, dense snowfall that bent the pine branches down to the ground and covered the trunks in a white, so even it looked painted. By December, the creek had frozen over completely, and Waverly had to break the ice with a rock every morning to fill the water containers. By January, the temperature hadn't risen above freezing in 3 weeks, and the forest had taken on that particular winter stillness that feels less like peace and more like the world holding its breath. Inside the train car, the fire burned steady. The stove ticked and pinged as the metal expanded and contracted with the heat. Jess was mending a tear in her jacket with a needle and thread she had traded for at a farm stand in town. Ridley was reading a paperback he had found in a donation bin outside a church, holding it close to the fire for light, turning the pages slowly, savoring each one. Waverly stood near the stove, adjusting a piece of wood that had shifted in the firebox. The heat rose against her face and she closed her eyes for a moment and just felt it. Warmth she had built. Warmth that didn't belong to someone else. Warmth that would still be here tomorrow because she would make sure of it. Then came the knock. 3 sharp taps. Spaced evenly, the sound of knuckles against steel, hesitant but deliberate. The room changed instantly. Jess looked up, her body tensing, the needle frozen mid-stitch. Ridley closed the book and went still, his eyes moving to the door with the quick, assessing focus of someone whose body remembers danger faster than his mind. Waverly didn't move right away. She stood by the stove, her hand still resting on the piece of wood, and she listened. 3 taps. That specific rhythm. Not the pounding of someone demanding entry. Not the scraping of wind or an animal. The knock of someone who wasn't sure they had the right to knock but had come too far to leave without trying. Something about it felt familiar. Not the sound itself, the energy behind it. The particular frequency of desperation mixed with pride that produces a knock exactly like that one. She walked to the door and opened it. The cold rushed in first the way it always did, a wall of frozen air that pushed past her and swirled into the interior. Then she saw them. Diane Felton looked smaller than Waverly remembered. Not just thinner, smaller, like something structural had been removed from inside her. Something that had been holding her upright for years and had finally given out. Her coat was the same one she had worn 2 years ago, but it hung differently now, loose through the shoulders, the buttons straining in the wrong places. Her hair, which had always been pulled back tight, was loose and tangled. Her face was drawn, the skin pulled close to the bone, and her eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes that Waverly remembered so well, were red-rimmed and wet. Behind her, Gordon Felton stood with his hands in his pockets, the same posture he'd had in the kitchen doorway 2 years ago. But the posture meant something different now. Then it had been the stance of a man who was ashamed but comfortable. Now it was the stance of a man who had been stripped of the comfort and left with only the shame. "We," Diane's voice cracked on the first word. She stopped, swallowed, tried again. "We didn't know where else to go." Gordon spoke next, quieter than his wife, the way he always spoke, like his voice had learned long ago to take up as little space as possible. "We lost the house," he said. "The medical bills, the interest, everything just fell apart." Snow clung to their coats. Their shoes were soaked through. They looked like they had been walking for a long time in weather that was not kind to people on foot. They looked, Waverly realized with a strange vertiginous clarity, exactly the way she had looked 2 years ago, standing in the cold with nowhere to go and a face full of things they couldn't say. Jess had risen to her feet. She stood behind Waverly, slightly to the left, and Waverly didn't need to look at her to know what her expression was. She could feel it, the heat of it, the anger that Jess carried on behalf of everyone who had ever been thrown away by the people who were supposed to keep them. Ridley had moved to the far wall. His shoulders were tight again, drawn up toward his ears in that old posture of self-protection. The past had walked in through the door, and his body had responded before his mind could catch up. Diane looked past Waverly into the train car. She saw the stove, the fire, the walls, the supplies. She saw the space that Waverly had built from nothing. And something moved across her face, too fast to name, but too slow to hide. Recognition, maybe. Or the sharper cousin of recognition, the understanding that the girl she had sent away with a duffel bag and $121 had built more from nothing than Diane had managed to hold on to with everything. Then it came. The sentence Waverly had known was coming the moment she saw them. The sentence that people like Diane always carry in their back pocket, the emergency currency of those who gave just enough to feel entitled to ask for more. "We took you in," Diane said. Her voice shifted. Harder now, not pleading, claiming. "We fed you. We gave you a roof for 9 years. We didn't have to do that." The words hung in the air like smoke. Waverly felt them land. She felt the weight of them, the familiar shape of an argument designed to convert shelter into debt, and meals into obligation. She had heard versions of this logic her entire life, in social workers' offices, in foster families' kitchens, in the quiet mathematics of systems that measure a child's worth in paperwork and payments. We didn't have to. 4 words. The 4 most honest words Diane Felton had ever spoken, and she didn't even realize how honest they were. She was right. They didn't have to. They had chosen to for money, and when the money stopped, they had chosen to stop. And now they were here in the cold, asking the girl they'd sent away to give them what they hadn't given her. A choice. A real one. Jess stepped forward. Her fists were clenched at her sides, her jaw tight, every line of her body broadcasting a fury that was older than this moment and bigger than these people. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, her voice low and shaking. "You threw her out on her birthday, in the middle of winter, and now you show up here and tell her she owes you." Diane flinched, a small, involuntary contraction, the flinch of someone who has never had their own logic turned against them at close range. "This isn't your business," Diane said, but the authority had drained from her voice. "It is my business," Jess said, "because I live here, because she built this, because you didn't." Ridley pressed himself harder against the wall. His eyes were wide, darting between the faces in the room, reading the tension the way animals read weather. Waverly raised her hand, not dramatically, not in command, just a small, steady gesture that said enough. Jess stopped. Her mouth was still open, the next sentence already formed and ready. But she stopped, because something in Waverly's hand and the quietness of the motion told her that this was not her fight to finish. Waverly looked at Diane, then at Gordon. She looked at them the way you look at a math problem you solved a long time ago and have no interest in solving again. Then she glanced over her shoulder, at the fire, at Jess still rigid with anger, at Ridley pressed against the wall but watching, at the silver coin above the stove catching the firelight in its small persistent gleam. For a moment everything went quiet. The wind outside paused, the fire settled. Even the metal of the train car seemed to stop its constant groaning, as if the structure itself was waiting to hear what she would say. And in that silence, Waverly understood something that she hadn't understood before. Not intellectually. She had understood it intellectually for months. She understood it now in the deeper way, the way that involves the chest and the stomach, and the place where decisions are made before they become words. Letting them stay would not be kindness. It would be repetition. It would be reopening a door she had closed on purpose, a door she had walked through in the wrong direction 2 years ago and sworn never to walk through again. It would be inviting back into her life the exact dynamic she had spent 2 years building something to replace, the dynamic of conditional presence, of love measured in utility, of people who stayed as long as it was convenient and left when it wasn't. She could see the future of that choice as clearly as she could see the fire. Diane would find things to criticize. The stove wasn't efficient enough, the walls weren't sealed properly, the food wasn't right. Gordon would shrink further into himself, taking up less and less space until he was barely visible. And slowly and visibly, the thing Waverly had built, not the train car, but the feeling inside it, the trust, the safety, the fragile and extraordinary fact of 3 people choosing each other, would erode. Not because Diane was evil, because some people carry an acid inside them that dissolves the structures of others, and they don't know they're doing it because they've never had a structure of their own that lasted long enough to be dissolved. Waverly stepped forward. She picked up a small bag she had prepared earlier. Not for this moment specifically. She kept emergency supplies packed at all times, a habit born of experience. Inside was canned food. A small amount of cash matches a wool scarf she had knitted badly from yarn she found at the thrift store. She set the bag on the floor in front of them. "This is what I can give," she said. Her voice was calm, level, carrying no anger, no satisfaction, no cruelty. Just the flat, clean sound of a person stating the fact. Diane looked at the bag, then at Waverly. Her frown deepened. Something flickered behind her eyes, the remnant of an expectation that had just been denied. "That's it," she said. Waverly met her eyes, held them, not in challenge, in clarity. "I don't owe you anything anymore," she said. "You gave me a roof because you were paid to. The payment stopped. You stopped. That was a transaction, not a relationship, and transactions end." She paused, Let the words settle the way snow settles on ground that isn't warm enough to melt it. I'm not angry. I understand why you did it. I understood it then, and I understand it now. But understanding is not debt, and your crisis is not my obligation. Gordon looked at the floor of the train car, at the steel that had once been frozen and bare and was now covered in salvaged wood planking that Waverly had cut and fitted by hand. He saw the work in it. He saw the hours in the phone and the bleeding hands. He saw what it had cost to build something from nothing because he had once known what it meant to try back before trying became too expensive, and he let his wife make the decisions for both of them. She's right, Diane, he said quietly. Diane turned to him, her eyes sharp, the old reflex of control surfacing even here, even now. But Gordon didn't flinch this time. He just picked up the bag from the floor and held it and looked at Waverly with something she had never seen in his face before and would never see again. Respect. Diane opened her mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time in Waverly's memory, Diane felt and had no words prepared. No rehearsed sentence, no script, just the raw, unfiltered experience of standing in front of someone she had underestimated and discovering that the underestimation was the most expensive mistake she had ever made. Gordon shifted behind her. He looked at Waverly, and in his eyes there was something that Diane's lacked. Recognition. Not of debt or obligation, but of the person standing in front of him. He saw her, maybe for the first time, not as the foster kid in the closet room, not as the line item that balanced the budget, as a person, a real one, standing in a place she had made real by the sheer relentless force of not leaving. He reached down and picked up the bag. His hands shook slightly. He nodded once, a small, private motion that contained more acknowledgement than any words he could have spoken. Then they turned and walked back into the snow. Waverly watched them for a moment. Just a moment. She saw their shapes diminish against the white, two dark figures growing smaller between the trees, leaning into the wind, carrying a bag that someone else had packed for them. She closed the door. Click. The sound was firm, final, but not cruel. It was the sound of a boundary, the sound of a woman who had learned the difference between a wall and a door and had chosen with full knowledge and clear eyes which one this would be. Inside, the fire kept burning. Jess sat back down slowly, the tension leaving her body in stages like water finding its level. She picked up the needle and thread and resumed her mending, though her hands were still trembling slightly. Ridley relaxed, his shoulders dropped, his breathing steadied. He looked at Waverly with an expression that contained a question he would never ask out loud, and she answered it without speaking by sitting down beside the stove and adding a piece of wood to the fire. The question was, are we safe? The answer was yes. Still yes. Always yes, as long as this fire burns and this door is mine to open and close. The silence that followed was not the silence of tension. It was the silence of aftermath. The quiet that comes when a storm passes and the air is still damp, but the pressure has broken. 4 days later, on a morning when the sky was the color of old pewter and the snow had stopped falling, but not yet started melting, there was another sound at the door. Not a knock this time, something softer, a scratching, tentative. Like an animal trying to get in, or a person who had never been taught how to knock. Then a pause. Then the scratching, again slightly louder, as if the person on the other side was gathering courage in small increments, each scratch a little braver than the last. Jess reached for her jacket, her instincts still sharp even after everything. Waverly shook her head. Whatever was on the other side of that door was not a threat. She could hear it in the sound, the timidity, the hesitation. Threats don't scratch. Threats pound. Waverly opened the door. The boy standing outside was not what she expected. He was 16, but he looked younger. Thin in a way that transcended hunger and entered the territory of illness, the particular thinness of a body that has been fighting something inside itself for a long time. His skin was pale, almost translucent, with dark circles under his eyes that looked permanent, like bruises that had given up on healing. He wore a coat that was too large for him, the same coat Gordon had been wearing 4 days ago, and his hands were bare and red and shaking. Brendan Felton. He stood in the doorway, and for a moment he just looked at her. Not the way Diane had looked with calculation and entitlement. Not the way Gordon had looked with shame and quiet recognition. Brendan looked at her the way people look at things they have been thinking about for a very long time, and have finally found the courage to face. My parents don't know I'm here, he said. His voice was thin, reedy, interrupted by a cough that he tried to suppress and couldn't. He pressed his fist against his mouth and waited for it to pass, his eyes watering. They didn't send me. Waverly stood in the doorway. Behind her, Jess had risen again, wary. Ridley was watching from beside the stove, still as stone. "Why are you here?" Waverly asked. Not unkindly, but directly. She had learned the value of direct questions. Brendan's face crumpled. Not dramatically. Not the way faces crumple in movies with sound and motion and tears that catch the light. It crumpled quietly the way paper crumples, when you hold it too tight, folding inward along lines that were already there. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," he said. The words came out rough, like they had been stored somewhere dry and unused for too long. "I knew," he continued, and now his voice was shaking, not from cold, but from the effort of saying something he had carried for years without putting it down. "I always knew they treated you differently. I knew the money was the reason they kept you. I knew when it stopped, they would make you leave. I knew all of it." He paused, coughed again, pressed his hand harder against his mouth. "And I didn't do anything. Because I was scared. Because I was sick. Because I told myself I was too young or too weak or too something, but I wasn't too young to know. I was old enough to know, and I chose not to say anything. And that's—" He stopped, swallowed. "That's the thing I can't stop thinking about." Waverly looked at him. She looked at his shaking hands and his hollow cheeks and the coat that belonged to his father hanging off his frame like a flag on a windless day. She looked at the boy who had coughed in the room down the hall while she packed her things on a Tuesday morning in February, the boy whose illness had been the reason, the excuse, the justification for everything that happened to her. She had never blamed him, not even in her worst moments, not even on the coldest nights, not even when the bitterness rose up in her throat and demanded a target. She had never aimed it at Brendan, because he was a child, because he was sick, because you cannot blame someone for the cost of their existence any more than you can blame a stone for the weight of its shadow. But she had also never heard him say it. She had never heard anyone from that house acknowledge what had happened to her with their actual voice, using actual words, standing in the actual cold. "You didn't owe me anything," she said. "You were a kid. You were sick." "That doesn't make it okay," Brendan said. "Being sick doesn't make you blind. I saw everything. I saw how my mom talked to you. I saw the bag by the door that morning. I heard the door close." His voice broke on the last word, fractured like ice under weight. "I was lying in bed and heard the door close, and I knew what it meant, and I didn't get up." The wind moved through the trees. Snow drifted down from a branch somewhere above, landing on Brendan's shoulder, white against the dark coat. Waverly felt something shift inside her. Not the sudden, dramatic shift of revelation, the slow, deep shift of something that has been settling for a long time and finally finds its resting place, like sediment at the bottom of a river, like the last piece of a foundation being laid. This boy, this sick, frightened, guilty boy, standing in the snow with his father's coat and his mother's silence, was the only person from that house who had ever seen her clearly. Not as a budget line, not as an inconvenience, not as a mouth to feed or a check to cash, as a person in a room at the end of a hallway who was being wronged quietly and systematically by the people who were supposed to protect her. He had seen it. He had been too young and too afraid and too sick to stop it. And he had carried that failure the way children carry adult failures, without the tools to process them and without the voice to speak them. Until now. Waverly did not invite him inside. She did not step back from the doorway. She did not open the door wider or gesture him toward the fire. Instead, she stepped outside. She sat down on the steps of the train car in the cold and the snow, and she looked at him. "Sit down," she said. He sat. Slowly, carefully, the way people sit when their bodies have been unreliable for so long that every movement requires negotiation. He settled onto the step beside her, leaving a small space between them, and he pulled the coat tighter around himself and waited. For a while, neither of them spoke. The forest was quiet. The wind had died down to a low murmur. Somewhere far away, a bird called a single note that rose and fell and didn't repeat. "I used to hear you coughing," Waverly said. "At night, through the wall. It was the last thing I heard before I fell asleep most nights." Brendan looked at her. His eyes were wet. "I never hated you for it," she said. "I need you to know that. I never blamed you, not once. What happened to me wasn't because you were sick. It was because the people who were supposed to take care of both of us decided that taking care of one of us was enough." She paused. Let the words reach him. Let them land. "You were 14 when they sent me away. 14 and sick. What were you supposed to do, chain yourself to the front door?" A sound came out of Brendan that was halfway between a laugh and a sob. He pressed his hands against his face and held them there. "I could have said something," he whispered through his fingers. "Maybe. And maybe it wouldn't have changed anything. You know your mother." He dropped his hands, looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the thing she hadn't expected to find in any pair of Felton eyes. Not gratitude, not relief, understanding. The real kind. The kind that doesn't make everything better but makes everything clearer. "How did you build all this?" he asked, looking at the train car behind them. The reinforced walls, the chimney releasing its thin line of smoke, the stacked firewood, the cleared path. "One day at a time," she said. "One problem at a time. One decision at a time." He nodded, the nod of someone who understood more than the words themselves. He looked at the chimney, the thin line of smoke rising straight into the still air, and she could see him calculating not the cost of it or the cleverness of it, but the patience, the sheer accumulation of days it represented. Days of choosing to stay and fix and try again. They sat together for a while longer, the cold pressed in, but neither of them moved to escape it. There was something in this moment that required the cold that needed the discomfort to be real, because what they were exchanging was not pleasantries. It was truth. And truth, like fire, requires air and friction and the willingness to sit with something that burns. Eventually, Waverly stood. She went inside and came back with a scarf, the one she had knitted badly from thrift store yarn, and a thermos of water she had heated on the stove. She gave them to Brendan. "This isn't a debt," she said. "This is a choice, my choice. There's a difference." Brendan took them. His hands were still shaking, but something in his grip had changed. It was firmer now, more present. "Thank you," he said. "You should go back before it gets colder. Can you make it?" He nodded. He stood up, wrapped the scarf around his neck, and held the thermos against his chest. He looked at her one more time, and in that look was something final. Not an ending, a completion. The closing of a circle that had been open for 2 years, drawn by two people who had been in the same house but never in the same room. He turned and walked into the trees. His footsteps were uneven in the snow, each one slightly different from the walk of a body that worked harder than it should have to for every step it took. But he walked, upright, with the scarf around his neck and the thermos against his chest and something lighter in his shoulders than what he had carried when he arrived. And he didn't look back. And Waverly watched him until the trees took him, and then she turned and went inside. The door closed behind her with the same click it always made. Not loud, not soft, just the sound of metal meeting metal of a latch finding its seat of a door doing what doors do. But this time the click meant something different. It wasn't the sound of closing something out. It was the sound of closing something complete. Jess was sitting by the fire. She had put down the needle and thread. She looked at Waverly with a question in her eyes, but she didn't ask it. She had learned in 2 years of living in this space that some things explain themselves if you wait long enough. Ridley was in his spot near the stove. He looked up when Waverly entered, and his face held something steady and warm, the expression of someone who trusts the person walking through the door. Waverly stood in the center of the train car. The fire crackled. The metal walls ticked softly as they absorbed and released heat. The wind outside was gentle now, a low sound that moved through the trees like a long exhale. She reached up and unhooked the silver coin from its nail above the stove. It came free easily, the wire loop sliding off with a faint metallic whisper. She held the coin in her palm and looked at it. Worn smooth, nicked near the rim, warm from the fire that had been burning beneath it for 2 years. She walked to the shelf where the metal box sat, the box she had pulled from beneath the floorboard on the worst night of her life. She opened it. The velvet lining was faded but intact. The remaining coins sat in their slots, each one a small piece of a story that spanned decades and distances, and the quiet, patient labor of a man who saw value in what others threw away. The empty slot was still there, bottom right corner, same size, same shape, waiting. Waverly placed the coin. It settled into the velvet with a soft, precise click. The fit was perfect. The slot had been made for this coin cut to its exact dimensions by hands that had known it would find its way home. The collection was complete. She stared at it for a long moment. 14 coins in one, 15 small circles of metal, each one found in a different place, at a different time, under different circumstances. And all of them gathered here in this box, in this train car, in this forest, by a man who believed that things discarded by the world could still be worth keeping. She closed the box, set it back on the shelf, and turned to face the room. Jess was watching her, not with the sharp, assessing eyes of the girl who had walked through the door 2 years ago ready to fight, with the steady, knowing eyes of someone who had been in the room for the whole story and understood what the last page meant. Ridley was watching too. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence, his calm, his willingness to be here said everything. Waverly sat down beside the fire. She pulled her knees up and rested her arms on them and looked at the flames. The train car was quiet. Not empty quiet, full quiet. The quiet of a space that holds exactly what it needs and nothing more. The quiet of three people breathing in the same room, each one having arrived from a different kind of wreckage. Each one having stayed for a different reason, and all of them sitting here now together in the warmth of a fire that none of them could have built alone. Outside, the winter continued. The snow fell. The wind moved through the branches and across the frozen ground and against the walls of a rusted freight car that sat on tracks that hadn't carried a train in decades. But inside, the fire burned. The walls held. The roof kept out the skikwen. And Waverly Marin, who had walked out of a house where no one called her name and into a forest where no one expected to find her, sat in the center of the only home she had ever built and understood finally completely, in a way that filled every corner of her and left no room for doubt, that she was not the girl who had been left behind. She was the one who stayed. And staying, she now knew, was not the absence of leaving. It was not passivity. It was not the failure to find something better. Staying was the hardest thing she had ever done. Harder than the cold, harder than the hunger, harder than the loneliness of those first nights when the wind screamed and the lighter wouldn't catch and the floor was frozen steel, and every reasonable voice in her head told her to get up and go. She had stayed. Through the storm, through the doubt, through the man who tried to take what wasn't his, through the woman who tried to collect a debt that didn't exist. She had stayed, and in staying, she had built something that no one could take and no storm could destroy. Not the train car, not the stove, not the roof or the walls or the chimney that drew smoke upward into a winter sky that didn't care. She had built the choice itself, the daily repeated unglamorous choice to be here, to remain, to tend the fire and fix what breaks and open the door when it matters and close it when it must. That was the inheritance, not the coins, not the letter, not the notebook full of dates and descriptions. Those were just the evidence. The proof that someone before her had understood the same truth and had lived by it quietly for decades in freight cars, in forests, in small houses near railroad tracks. The inheritance was the understanding that value does not leave just because the world stops paying attention. That worth does not expire. That some things, the realest things, are only visible to people who choose to look. Her grandfather had looked. He had seen coins where others saw debris. He had seen a granddaughter where the system saw a case number. And Waverly had looked. She had seen a home where others saw rust. She had seen a family where others saw strangers. The fire popped. A log shifted, sending a shower of sparks upward that disappeared into the dark above. The coin, newly placed in its slot, was invisible inside the closed box on the shelf. But Waverly could feel it there. Complete. Whole. The way she could feel the people beside her and the warmth around her and the particular deep stillness that comes when something broken has been made, not fixed, not repaired, not restored to what it was before, but made into something new, something stronger, something that knows its own worth because it had to discover it from scratch. Jess added a log to the fire. The flames climbed, the light grew. Ridley turned a page in his book, and Waverly rested. Not the way she had rested on that first night, barely alive, clinging to a coin and a memory. She rested the way a person rests when they have done the work and the work has held. When the fire they built is burning and the roof they patched is keeping out the sky and the people they chose are still here, Still breathing, still staying. She rested because she had earned it. And because tomorrow the fire would need tending, and the wood would need splitting, and the walls would need checking, and the world would keep doing what the world does. But tonight the door was closed, and the fire was lit, and the collection was complete. And that was enough.